Welcome everybody to Module 0, an introduction to metadata by the Aristotle Metadata Registry. In this module, what we're really focusing on is getting everybody on the same page to understand exactly what metadata is and really building up a single terminology that we can use to describe what it is we're doing as metadata managers and how we can communicate that out. So you may have come across a lot of these terms before, but the idea is this module helps us all communicate in that same language so that when new users start coming onto the platform, we can communicate that properly to them as well. By the end of this module, these are the things that we really want to cover. So it's that difference between data and metadata and why it's important. We're going to have a little bit of a look at where you can find existing examples of metadata. So we always know that there's metadata within your organization. So we want to help you find where those are so you can start pulling them into an Aristotle Metadata registry. We're going to look at a couple of different data and metadata standards that are used within Aristotle and also within the wider community to record this information. And then lastly, we're going to look at registration endorsement and how that applies to things like performance indicators and how I can use those different endorsement processes as part of my role as a metadata manager in my everyday life within an Aristotle Metadata registry. So step one is really looking at what is data? Like it sounds like a really rudimentary question, but it's really important because it kind of brings us back to the bare bones of what we're trying to achieve. What we can do is we can think of data as any collection of recorded information that we can use to analyze, to get insights about certain activities within a population, around events, around people, around processes. Data isn't just a singular mass, it's often broken down into different components. So think about like columns within a spreadsheet, fields within a specialized statistical format. But the idea is that there's break down data described in a singular sense. So rather than just a big broad data collection of every Australian, we can go, oh, I've collected data about people, I've collected data about events, I've collected data about businesses or institutions. This is really useful because it allows us to think of metadata in two very different ways. On the one hand, we have what we can call descriptive metadata. So this is metadata about an entire data set. So this is really, really specific to that whole data set. And it's things like, when was it collected? What's the name of this data set? Who published it? What's the coverage? Like in time and in space, where does it cover? Is it just from 1 year? Is it from one state? Is it multiple years? Is it for an entire country or is it for the entire world? And this descriptive information is really valuable for describing one set of data. So there's not a lot of what we call reuse around this. I can't use the title of a data set for a different data set. They're going to be named differently. When we start talking about metadata reuse, what we want to start thinking about is what we call structural metadata. So the metadata about those individual components within the data set. So I know there are lots of data sets out there that collect information about people and their age and hospitals and waiting times, and I know there's information about students and businesses. Being able to record all of those conceptual components in a very structural way tells us exactly what the data means and helps us find other data sets that are around. But there is some effort in recording this information. So why is it important to start recording information, not just at a data set level, but at this? We kind of put ourselves in the kind of mindset of our random kind of example data analyst who's looking for data across an agency. They're looking for information about students, not just anybody. They really want information about students. Having this broken down for each data set allows them to start narrowing it down so they can start looking at students, narrowing it down further to find information about their education level as opposed to potentially enrollment date. And then lastly, having that descriptive component allows them to pull data just from a particular year. So all of a sudden, because I've got all of these different components described, I have the ability to find and potentially link this data together. Because I was to jump back and go, well, I really just want to find student education level information from any year. being able to jump back and find all of those components becomes really, really valuable for data linkage and data kind of analysis activities. As another example, these definitions become really important around the comparison of data. So if I've got my data about children or students from 2015 and I want to compare it with other data, how can I know that I can do that? What can I do to kind of build up that confidence that this data is accurate? Well, the way that we can do that is, again, we look at the metadata. And to do that, I want to run through a couple of really good examples that we've seen in practice that really describe this, this problem really well. So for example, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, who publishes information about gender equality indicators across Australia, collects full-time employment data as defined by that organisation. So every business in Australia reports back and tells the Workplace Gender Equality Agency how many people are employed in full-time work based on their own internal definitions. Now, this might be 30, 35, 40 hours, but it really comes down to that particular organisation. And this is because data is recorded at an aggregate level, not at an individual level. So it's reported for the entire organisation, not just for one individual. By comparison, the Australian Bureau of Statistics defines full-time employment data as people who usually work 35 hours or more a week. There's a slight difference in these terminologies, and the question comes, if I'm comparing data from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, are they comparable based on these definitions? As another example, again, pulling from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, they've got the difference between a standard report and then their whole of collection reporting data. In this, they define a relevant employer as somebody with over potentially 500 or more employees, or when they're reporting against the entire data set, they report against everybody with more than 100 employees. So if you fall in that 100 to 500 employee gap, you might not appear in the minimum standards report, whereas you will appear in the reporting data. If I'm looking at these two reports and trying to compare information, is it possible? Well, again, like the question there really is, it depends, and we'll cover that in a second. As a final example, metadata becomes really valuable for describing and comparing data across time. So here we're looking at the same data set, looking at that definition of a relevant employer and seeing how in 2016 there was an amendment to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency Act that said previously a relevant employer was somebody with 100 or more employees. However, if during that year, they changed the definition so that if during that year, if you fell below that 100 employees but still had over 80 employees, so if you dropped from 100 to 99, you were still included in future data sets. So they changed slightly how they were defining this definition. So jumping back to our analyst's earlier question, can I compare the data that has these different definitions? The answer really is, it depends. Data generally has to be operated on an as-is basis. We can't historically go back and recollect it. We can't change what it was. We can't alter who was included in a collection. But having those metadata definitions helps us explain the differences between them if we're looking at why somebody is included in one data set or another. What we often like to say is Aristotle is what powers the asterisks and the footnotes in these reports to help people understand why data is collected in different ways. So ultimately, the decision comes down to a case-by-case basis. But the important thing is, if you've got the metadata that describes why data sets are different, then you can use that as part of your analysis. So in summary, we really want you to kind of focus on, when you're communicating this out to people, the importance of metadata is around how it assists with data activities. It makes it easier for us to understand and interpret the data by recording these things in a really clear, discrete way. And throughout the course of the day, we'll look at some really good examples of this about how we collect things or describe things like an employer or an agency or a child or an event or a student. And because we can improve the understanding and interpretation of this data, it increases our accuracy for other data activities such as analysis, and especially when looking at data linkage. Because I know that two data sets have the same definition, I know that they're going to have the same data, and I have a higher level of assurance when I start trying to bring them together. So the next question is, where is it stored currently? And how can I use this information to kind of capture it within Aristotle? As a summary, metadata is stored in a lot of places at the moment. These are all of the terms that I want you to become familiar with, because these are all of the ways that we've seen metadata collected in the past. Commonly, it's referred to as things like a business glossary or a data glossary or a data dictionary, or sometimes you will see it referred to as a metadata registry. These can be online, they can be print publications, they can be done through websites or shared drives. There's a lot of really different places and different ways that this information is recorded. One that we've started to see used quite a lot recently is reference data. We're talking about like code lists, like the ANSCO classifications or our international classifications for disease. But the idea is there is more than likely a lot of different places that your organization is already recording metadata in an ad hoc fashion that could be improved by a more structured process. To look at some really tangible examples of this, we're going to bring up some examples from Australian government websites that publish this kind of information already. In this first example, we're looking at a snapshot from data.gov.au that's describing some descriptive metadata about a data set called the Labour Market Information Portal. On here, we're going to start pulling out common attributes and talk about how these apply back to metadata generally and Aristotle. So as we can see, most or all metadata needs a name to help us understand, what it is. We can also start to see that it has somebody responsible for it that's recorded against it. So especially for government or well-managed metadata, we need to know who to go to ask for clarification, or who's responsible for updating this for me. There'll be a definition that describes in plain text what this means. This is really important for conceptual metadata that describes like our individual columns. And then we'll have our data element definitions. And this is especially common for whole data set or for descriptive metadata to record what all of the columns within a data set mean. As a second example, we're going to look at some structural metadata from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So this is a little bit dated. I think the ABS has recently updated their website. But what we can see is we're starting to see common attributes coming through. We have a name and a definition, which is really important. We also have information about who this data is collected about. So highest level of education attained is only collected about people 15 years and over. So we know that we can't look to this data for information about children in schooling, for example. It also has information about the data type and the codes. Even though this looks like a number, I can't use it as a number. I couldn't find the average highest level of educational attainment, because the average of 1 and 10 being a postgraduate degree and then a specialization of a postgraduate degree would get me somewhere in a high school level value. So I know that I can't treat this as a standard number. It needs to be treated as a list of codes instead, even though it might be stored as a number when it's physically stored in a database. The other thing that I can see here is I can see the endorsement details again. Who's responsible for this and when was it published? Because it's from the ABS website, I know that it's an ABS publication, and I also know that it was applicable from an October release in the 2016 census. So I know that I couldn't use this data, or I couldn't use this definition for anything that preceded the 2016 census, and I might want to look for a more up-to-date version when the census is run again next year. Lastly, we've got an example from a PDF file. So this is a print publication that's put online called the Avetmus Vocational and Education Training Dataset. So again, another really good government definition. And the idea is here is that we want to demonstrate that it's not just on websites. This is a print publication that's passed around through the education sector to help people record information about vocational training. And again, we start to see the same things come through. This is a name and a definition. We know that this is a country identifier component, and we also know that, again, it's not a number. even though it's constructed of digits, 1s and 2s and 4s and 7s and so on, I know that I can't treat it as a number generally because it's a oh, hang on. It's not a postcode. It's a country identifier. So I even know that it's not a postcode. So I know that I can't connect it to a postcode. It needs to be something else. I know what it measures. So this is information about a training organization. It's not information about a trainer or potentially even a school. It's just about any training provider that's delivering information at a location. And I also know the endorsement details. So this is the data file for the November 2016 release. And I also know it's the 8th version. So I might be looking for the 9th or 10th now, and I know who to go to ask for that information. The last example we're going to look at is one that you're going to become very familiar with over the rest of the day. And that's an example that we've pulled out of Aristotle. We look at all of these websites and we can start to see a lot of commonality, and I'm going to run through those one last time. So again, we see a name and definition. We see data types and measurements that come through as well. So I know that this is, again, a number of minutes. So there's a way that I can add this together that's not going to be treated like a standard decimal. I can know exactly how long the maximum field length is. So if I get minutes that are, if I get something like 1,000 minutes, I know that that's going to be invalid. I can't actually store that. I know that it's invalid. Somebody hasn't given me the correct data, or I might need to go back and ask some questions. I know what this was measured about. So we were interested in a service contact event, and we were measuring the total duration of that event in minutes, not hours, not seconds, not decades. I know that it should be treated as a number of minutes. And then we have the endorsement details. So this was endorsed by a particular group. So this is one that we published through our own registry to demonstrate this example. I know who's responsible for it. I know if there's any newer or older definitions. I know who to go to talk about it, and I know how to identify it within my registry. So we're starting to see a lot of really common attributes across all of these websites that describe the information that needs to be collected. So what we've started to see is this common idea of storage. So what is the data that's being stored? This was common in the Evetmus one, the Aristotle example, and the census one, where we started to see there was a list of codes, there was a maximum length that the data might take up, and also what units were used to measure it. This is information that traditional metadata systems do very well. They're very good at describing the structural or physical tables that are necessary to record data. But what we started to see as well was the things that were being measured. This very, very conceptual side. What was information being collected about? Well, it was about a person aged 15 years or over. It was about a service event. It was about a training organization. And I was collecting particular things about them. So I was collecting the duration of a training event. I was collecting the highest level of educational attainment that a person had received. This is information that doesn't have units. It's a very conceptual side of the metadata. And the reason that we store these separately is because they allow us to interrogate the data in very different ways. On the conceptual side, I might be looking for all information or all data about the age of a person. I may not be as interested in how that was recorded. It might have come through as a number, it might have been recorded as some text in a field on a form, or it might be recorded as a list of codes. If I know that these all relate back to the same concept, I can change how that data is interpreted, or I can clean it up during my processing to make sure that I can use it. If I found data that had a person's age as a number of years and a person's age as a selection from a list of codes, I could convert that number of years into that set of codes, and all of a sudden I can link or compare that data. The other thing that we do is we break down this idea of this conceptual side into those two very clear components. What is the thing that we observed this information about? So was it a person, a business, an event? Being able to discretely talk about all of these things gives a very clear picture about what an organization does from an information architecture perspective. If I know that an organization only collects information about schools, training, and children, I know that it's a primary education provider. Whereas if they're collecting about information about hospitals and emergency admission events, I know that they're probably a healthcare provider. And then we start looking at the things that we collected about these objects that we observed. So we start to ask, what is the age of a person? What are the opening hours of a business? What is the start time of an event? Because we can record these separately, we can start to see all of the different things that we collect about these different objects. What information do we collect about people? Do we need to recollect it again if we're already asking their age in one place? Is it necessary for us to ask their date of birth in another, and so on? In our storage side, we start to see, again, those common things fall out. Our data types, our codes, what are the measurements that we're using to record it? And the idea that we capture all of this conceptual side about that data means that we can start to compare it between systems. One system may record years, year, month, day. One may do day, month, year. If we're working internationally, we may see month, day, year. And the idea is that if I've recorded the structure and the format that these come back in, even if I can reduce it down to a number or a string, I can still convert between different data formats so that my data has richness within this ecosystem. When we build it up, we see a system that looks a little bit like this. So we get our object that we observed, the attribute that we measured, and the way that that data was stored. So as a really clear example, we're going to talk about a person's age. So we have this idea of a person who is a human being. It may be a citizen. We may only be collecting information about people who are of a certain age or within a certain state, and we'll be collecting their age. And as silly as it seems, we might want to really discreetly record the fact that it's recorded as a number of years. The reason why that's important is, especially when linking across sectors, when we're looking at education versus health, within the health sector, it's very common for a child to have their age recorded as a number of months, or in a hospital setting, in a number of minutes. The age of a child can change quite dramatically after birth, and saying that this is a person's age as a number of minutes versus number of years ensures that when we try and connect that data together, we're drawing the right conclusions. And as a bit of a surprise, congratulations, we just taught you an entire ISO standard. Well, part of an ISO standard anyway. One of the backbones of Aristotle is the description of data in this way. And this is something that we didn't invent. This is something that we've taken from a very well-established international standard for data definitions. It talks about this thing that we're collecting data about as an object class. The things that we've gathered about these object classes are called properties, and a value domain is how we have recorded this data in an individual system in an individual way. How are we recording that as a series of codes, as numbers, and so on. By bringing all of these components together, we can create what's called a data element that gives us a complete picture of how this data was described. A person's age as a number of years, a business's name as a text field that's only 200 characters long, an event start date that's recorded day, month, year, hours, minutes, seconds. It tells us a complete picture of what this data means. So in summary, we've started to see a little bit more about this conceptual side of metadata and started to understand that this conceptual metadata is really, really important because it does help us interpret this data properly. It's necessary for us to understand not just how the data was structured, but what the data means. And that really comes down to what was the information I collected, how, and how was it stored. So the next part of this training, we're going to look at different metadata standards that Aristotle uses. One of the things that we impress upon our users quite heavily, and one of the things that we're quite proud of at Aristotle Metadata, is that we haven't invented any of these information standards. There are several information management standards that exist that make it really, useful, or there are several information management standards that exist that allow people to communicate using the same vocabulary. Like the idea of using a singular vocabulary ensures that when we're talking with our counterparts in other agencies or other organizations, we can start communicating in the same ideas and this reduces the effort necessary for us to share or collect information. So to start off with, what we want to understand is what types of metadata can we record in a metadata registry? Well, we've already started to look at these data definitions. Can I describe all the concepts behind my data? Can I describe what the data sets themselves are? Can I structure them in an appropriate way? But we can also start to record performance frameworks and indicators to understand why the data was collected and how that impacts on our policy performance. We can record generic business glossaries to be able to say what certain things mean. So if we have a widely used acronym or a widely used piece of jargon, we can define this in a single clear location so that people can go there and understand what these concepts are. We can record classifications and code lists. So this is commonly referred to as things like controlled vocabularies, reference data, or your general statistical classification. We can record these in a structured, flat or hierarchical way, so that when somebody's trying to interpret data and they see a code value that says 7, they can correctly interpret that as a job title or a level of education. And then lastly, we can start to record questionnaires and surveys that are used to collect all of this data. This allows us to describe the ways that questions were asked, because this can become very important when looking at the biases that were used when data was collected. How a question is asked can very dramatically change what data is given. And recording this within a metadata registry like Aristotle makes it easy for us to find where those questions were asked and what that data means and how it was used. So to begin with, we're going to have a quick look at ISO 11179. This is really the backbone of everything that's in Aristotle, and it really describes, it's a core component for how everything else is kind of pinned together. ISO 11179 is a standard that's used across government. Thanks to the Aristotle Metadata Registry, this is seeing wider and wider adoption across the Australian government sector, but it's also been used quite heavily and for many decades at other departments as well, including the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the US Bureau of Labour Statistics, and other government statistical organisations internationally. The idea that ISO 11179 gives us is it gives us a framework for describing data definitions and data sets data definitions and data sets and the registration of them as well. So it gives us a model that we can use and a common vocabulary that we can use to talk about our data within our organization so that people aren't bringing new terms into the organization to describe the same or similar activities, and so that when we're talking with other departments, we can communicate using this same language as well. One of the newest and most important components of 11179 is Part 7 that really describes a clear framework for talking about data sets. It talks about data sets and distributions as a collection and an individual file of data. And we'll look at some examples of that in later training components. One thing that it also introduces to us is the idea of a data set specification, something that you might have seen called a schema in the past as well. A data set specification is a way for describing the data that we want to be collected. This is really important when a government or when an agency or an organization doesn't have the ability to collect data itself and passes a specification on to another organization to collect data for them. As examples, we might see a data set specification defined at a federal level that's passed down to states for them to record information back. It might be done at an organizational level that requires other sub-organizations to collect that data. For example, an educational organization getting data from schools, or it might be part of a data sharing agreement between two unrelated sectors. A data set then describes the actual data that was collected. So if I say to somebody, I would like you to go off and collect data that includes a person's name as a piece of text that's 200 characters long, and they go off and they collect data that has a person's name as 250 characters long, for example, because they found that there were operational restrictions that prevented that from happening. Knowing the difference between those two becomes very important, especially when data has been collected from multiple organizations. As we saw earlier, ISO 11179 also has a very great, very comprehensive data description component that talks about this object, class, property, value domain, data element idea of breaking down the definitions for individual parts of data. It then links these back to the data sets themselves to allow us to link together data sets and find where common definitions are used. What you'll start to see as we go through is that this will come up quite a lot, and you'll start to see also that you don't have to create many of these over time, because often you'll find that there'll only be a small number of between 5 to 10 to 20 object classes within an organization. Beyond a person, an event, and a business, there's not many specialized data object classes you'll create. The other thing that ISO 11179 brings us is a clear registration and endorsement framework for helping us describe how data was approved for collection. So this is as we used the example from the ABS before, this is that endorsement details component of telling people how data should be used. ISO 11179 gives us 7 levels with 8 registration states that can be used by an organization to describe how data is approved for use. There's no real restriction on how you define what a standard is. All the ISO standard says is that you must define what these levels mean and how they're approved. And throughout Aristotle, you can do that. You can say a standard piece of metadata is some content that has gone through a particular approvals process and has been discussed by a particular body. This gives people confidence in where this data has come from. So as an example, you'll start to see these endorsement bodies take on a number of different names. So committees, standards bodies, technical change boards, data councils. Generally, there's a lot of different names for these, but you'll start to see that these are the organizations or teams within an organization that have the ability to approve data for collection and publication moving forward. The big advantage of the ISO standard and Aristotle is that we're not wedded to one single organization. As we know, in the government context, many different organizations may endorse content for use so that we can understand whether or not a definition can be reused across sectors or across organizations. As a tangible example, I might have some data that defines how to collect a person's information. And this might be endorsed by 2 different areas, a health agency data governance board and an education agency reporting board. One of them has endorsed this as a retired piece of information that should no longer be used, and one of them has reported it as a standard. The question then becomes for our data analyst, if I'm looking for data or metadata about training and learning, which one of these should I listen to? Which authority should I listen to know that this data is approved for use? In this case, because we're looking for data and metadata about training and learning, it's probably more appropriate for us to follow the Educational Agency Reporting Board. However, if our data analyst was looking for data and metadata about training and learning in a medical context, perhaps this isn't appropriate for use. The important thing to note is that these standardization processes and these common vocabularies give our data analysts the confidence to pick the right one based on the information they're given. One other thing that we start to see or start to talk a lot about within Aristotle is the ability to manage performance management. This is the ability for us to record the reasons that we're collecting data. What is the aspirational goal of an organization and how are we getting there? To understand this, we again have to look at the difference between an outcome and an indicator. An outcome is an immeasurable goal that we want to achieve. It's something that makes our organization feel good. As a really great example, we can start to talk about the Millennium Goals that were defined by the United Nations. These were a series of large aspirational outcomes for the entire world, talking about water quality, social equality, and general progress within society. What we can then define is a series of indicators that are necessary for us to record performance towards those goals. As an example, we've taken one from the New South Wales Department of Family and Community Services that allows us to look at what these indicators mean. The Family and Community Services Department has defined a series of 7 outcomes that are necessary for us to measure positive progress for people within New South Wales. To look at one of these in focus, we can look at this idea that we want all people in New South Wales to be safe. This is a very good and aspirational goal. This is something that we want to achieve. It makes us personally and professionally feel good about our data organisation. But the question is, how can we guarantee that people are safe? It's such a broad concept. Well, the Department of Family and Community Services has already broken this down into a number of indicators on their website so that they can record each of the different components of this. So I can say one way that I know that people are safe is we can record data about children and young people and determine whether or not they're at a level of the level of protection that they're provided by social organisations. What I can then do within my registry is I can break this down further and start to look at all of the individual data that either I or other organisations need to collect to measure my progress towards this positive goal. The way that we do this isn't new as well. We've taken a framework called, again, ISO 17117 that looks at describing a common language for describing performance indicators. This is, again, quite broadly used at a number of different health organisations, and one that we've kind of omitted here is the World Health Organization publishes a number of frameworks for measuring health performance. The Canadian Institute for Health Information and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, through their Aristotle Registry, also use this ISO standard for recording performance in these broad social equality indicators. The way that this is done is, again, we start to look at indicators as a way to measure this positive change through society. Each of these describes one individual component that's reported on, and we need to understand how is that expressed. Is that a number? Is that a code? Is it a range? Is it a percentage? We need to understand the numerators and denominators that go up into measuring this indicator, especially if it's reported as a percentage. We want to understand what are we recording? Are we looking at number of interactions across a total population? Are we looking at number of events for everybody who comes into contact with a service provider, and so on? One other important attribute of this is what we call a disaggregator. So an aggregator is a way for us to bring data together, and a disaggregator is a term for us to break that data apart. And this is commonly seen on things like data dashboards. The idea behind a disaggregator is we want to understand the ways that we can look at this data in individual ways. So for example, if we were collecting data at an entire country level, for example with Australia, we might want to also look at how we can look at this reported value for each individual state, for particular social status levels or for social equality levels, or we might be looking at how an indicator is performing for the whole population versus an Indigenous or a migrant population as well, to make sure that everybody's achieving the same positive levels of change. As an example, we're going to run through an example that looks at disability within the Indigenous sector in the Australian Health, that was designed by the Australian Health Department. To look at this, we need to understand the numerators that go into this. So to understand the rate of people that are, that have a limited ability capacity, firstly, well, what is the age of this person? Because it's really important to understand, and their Indigenous status as well, if this is a component in understanding how Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, interact with the health system. We might then look at ways to break this number down to report on as a percentage of the population. We may need to understand the number of people or the parts of the population that have a disability and what that disability is defined as. It might be a plain text, but in this case, we need to understand that the data has been collected that follows a specific disability code set guideline. And then we might want to understand how we can break this down to understand that how all parts of the population are working towards benefiting from this positive change. In this example, we might look at, again, understanding how it's broken down by Indigenous status or Australian state to make sure that everybody is achieving this same positive outcome. And then lastly, we'll want to know how it's reported so that I know what it means when I'm looking for it in a final report or policy program. In this example, we might be reporting this as a decimal against the people that we've collected it against. So the idea here is, again, we're looking at a very common framework necessary for describing performance indicators, their linkages to outcomes and performance frameworks as well. So in summary, there's a lot of metadata modeling standards that exist, and we've tried to capture a few of those today, looking at that broad information architecture, data definitions, and performance indicators. We're not going to run through every component of Aristotle, but we will see where we can find more information today. And the reason that we've looked at these is, again, these standards exist to assist with that common vocabulary across organizations. Even internally, we want to make sure that everybody's talking the same language and describing their data in the same way. One of the aspirations that we have at Aristotle is to assist with the facilitation of conversations like, what is your list of object classes? What is your list of properties about those object classes? Because those two questions give us a very clear and quick insight to all of the data that's collected in an organization. Once we know those, we can then start asking about what are the performance indicators that you're using these for, and how is it collected and reported on. And these international standards give us the information to do this in a clear and consistent way. The last thing that we're going to look at in this section is talking about governance and roles, specifically within Aristotle, because it's important for us to understand what I can do in relation to these endorsement processes. Within Aristotle, we have 3 levels of organization, or 2 levels of organization and 3 different types that can be used for us to understand who's responsible for keeping all of these definitions we've started talking about collecting up to date, and who's responsible for publishing them as well. At the top level, we have this idea of a stewardship organization. This is what we could commonly call the overall owner of the metadata. Who should I contact when I need to let someone know that something's out of date? Who's responsible for keeping it up to date? Should I know that this is a trusted organization that I know isn't going to change a definition without consulting with the appropriate stakeholders? Underneath this, we have the next 2. Firstly, we have our registration authority. So this is where we start talking about that endorsement. So we can have multiple registration authorities within a stewardship organization or across stewardship organizations responsible for endorsing metadata. This is what allows us to give the stamp of approval to say this metadata is good for use. And we need to know, when we endorse this information, who endorsed it, why, and whose authority did they have to do it. And then lastly, we want to look at our work groups. So these are more of an operational group within Aristotle that allow us to segment a lot of this work out. This comes down to a very low level permission set that allows us to ask, who's the person who authored this information and put it into the registry? Who's the person that I can speak to about finding other metadata? And who are the people in my team who I can ask for help to assist me with getting this information ready for approval? The way that these are structured within any individual Aristotle metadata registry is like this. A stewardship organization exists within our top level Aristotle metadata registry and is responsible for a number of work groups within it, and also responsible for a number of registration authorities who will endorse content. In this way, we know who the single group is that's responsible for all of the groups and endorsement processes within this part of the registry. And we say within this part of the registry because there may be one or more stewardship organizations that exist within a single registry. So if your organization has a registry of its own, there may be multiple organizations that exist in there that are necessary to capture different silos of a business organization, or to allow us to capture different departments that are working within a single sector that have an agreement to share the same space. The idea is that there's a large growing ecosystem of separate registries, and within those registries, these organizations exist. At a personal level, it's important to understand what activities you may be able to perform as part of your role within the Aristotle Metadata Registry. Where possible, we've tried to link these roles back to parts of the ISO standard to, again, make sure that people are using the same terminologies. Within a stewardship organization, you're most commonly going to be a member, somebody who can view the work groups, be assigned to a work group in that organization, and be able to participate in certain processes and see information that's been published just to you. The lower level from membership is just a viewer. This is somebody who's been invited to only be a collaborator, but can't be somebody who's creating or editing content within that organization. And as we move up the chain, we have this idea of a data steward or a metadata steward who has the ability to edit endorsed content. So generally after metadata has been endorsed, the people who have created it may no longer have access to keep it up to date. This responsibility then falls on the stewards to update and change endorsed metadata to make sure that it remains current and up to date. They can also participate in discussions within the workgroup, upload content, and publish non-endorsed metadata. So if metadata has not gone through an endorsement process but still needs to be made available, they have the ability to do that as well. And then at our top level, we have our administrators. An administrator is very much an operational component of the stewardship organization who has all of the lower permissions and is responsible for managing members and assigning roles in ways that we'll see in later training. Within our registration authorities, we have two broad roles. We have registrars who operate on behalf of the registration authority to approve metadata and to endorse metadata and approve reviews. So in this sense, they can be seen as a person acting on behalf of the organization, but they aren't endorsing the information as themselves. The other role we have is the operational manager role, who can again add members and assign roles within that organization, update definitions, and change the meaning of certain status levels. And then lastly, we have our workgroup roles. Our workgroups can basically be thought of as our teams within the registry. So just like we have teams within our organization, a workgroup helps us work with the people on a particular task or a particular project to get it ready for the final endorsements. Within this, we have our viewers who have the ability to collaborate with us. They won't have the ability to edit content within the workgroup, but they can participate in discussions, participate in reviews, and open issues and make suggestions to content. Our submitters will be able to create content and submit it to the workgroup. They'll also, again, be able to participate in discussions and reviews and open issues to assist with that operational updating and creation of content. Workgroups can also have the ability to define a steward just for that group. So if a workgroup has been defined for a project or a component of metadata that needs to be kept up to date, such as a centralized list of classifications or concepts, a steward can be assigned to the workgroup to keep content in that area up to date, but only in that group. They again also have the ability to participate in discussions and reviews and open issues. And then lastly, we have our managers. A manager is, again, much like the administrator and manager of other groups within the registry, has the ability to assign roles and update and change details about the group, remove people, and archive the work group when it's no longer in use. The idea is, within Aristotle, you wear many hats. Your responsibilities may change just as your responsibilities within your organization may change. You're not constrained to one set of permissions, and as you move throughout the registry, you may find that early on you may only have view or edit access to certain particular things, but as you become a member of more and more groups, you may find that you're now responsible for the endorsement of certain content as well, or responsible for keeping certain definitions up to date. The idea is that within Aristotle, you have the ability to wear all of these roles, and Lauren in the next session will show you how you can find what your roles within the registry and your associated permissions are. But Aristotle gives you the ability to really define what your role in the registry is through being assigned these different permissions in different groups. So in summary, your role within the registry is fluid. You have the ability, or the registry has the ability to define what your role is in a different basis in different groups. As we saw, work groups are that collaboration aspect that we'll look at in Unit 2 or in Module 2. Our registration authorities are really focused on the capture and endorsement of data. And our stewardship organisations are really focused on that ownership of data to allow for multiple business units within the registry to have their own separate processes and to kind of segment different business units where there's an organisational necessity for it. That brings us to the end of Module 0. But if you need further help, these are the places that you probably immediately need to go to. And we'll, again, cover this a little bit more in Module 1. Probably the best place to look is within your registry. In your registry, if you go to the help page, there's a little icon in the top right. It will take you to a help page that will give you links to these other two areas. There's a little bit of inbuilt help into Aristotle, but we are expanding the Aristotle Metadata knowledge base. And if you just search for that, you'll find a link to that. But we will be providing a list of links to users as well. The other thing that we just encourage everybody to look at and to join is the Aristotle Metadata community. As I've said, we are seeing a growth in metadata management across the Australian and international government sectors, and we really want to bring users together. The people who are best positioned to describe their metadata usage and how they're integrating Aristotle is the users themselves. If you've got questions about how people are using Aristotle metadata, we want to really encourage that community aspect to allow you to seek feedback from ourselves and the rest of our users. If you'd like to know about how people are integrating it, again, this is probably the best place to ask. That brings us to the end of Module 0. So I'm really glad that you came along today and you sat through this. The next couple of examples that we're going to be running through will be a little bit more interactive and we'll have some components on that. But what we'll do is we'll end here